This week I'm going to be going through the pros and cons of shooting with fluorescent lights or LEDs. Hello, my name is Simon Cade and this is DSLRguide. So when I first started out with lighting, I used dominantly LED lights, but now I tend to shoot mostly with fluorescents and then have the LEDs for other uses. So I just wanted to go through what the differences are between these and how an LED affects your workflow on set and how fluorescent lights, because there are some pretty big differences. So for the purpose of this comparison, I'm going to be comparing both lights within the same kind of price range. So I'm not talking about the really high-end LEDs that cost hundreds and hundreds. I'm talking about things like the R300 and the Aputure AL528. So these are your kind of £150, $250 range LEDs. And in terms of fluorescent, I'll be talking about the light fixtures which take multiple ones of these bulbs. But to be honest, these features do totally apply to the more expensive LEDs and to the cheaper LEDs, and kind of the same with fluorescent. So no matter what your budget is, this should be able to give you a pretty good idea of what some of the main differences are. So firstly, let's talk about the advantages of LEDs. Now the first thing is that you have the choice between powering it by the wall or by a battery. And this is a really nice feature because it means that you can be totally wireless, totally away from power, and still have the performance of your lights. Now that is a really massive feature. So that means these lights are a lot more portable. You don't have to worry about cables and extension leads, but also it means you can just use them wherever you are, whether you're outdoors or whether you're in an old building that doesn't have any power at all. You won't have any problems with using these lights. The next thing is that most LEDs will have a dimmer, which is pretty useful because it means you can dial in exactly how much light you want. So you can have very precise control over the exposure without having to move the light around or put ND gels in front of it. Now let's talk about the advantages of fluorescent lights. The big thing with fluorescents is that you can get, for the same price, a much brighter output than your LEDs. So with lights, more power is almost always a good thing. It means that you can have your lights further away if you need to, it means you can have more diffusion if you want that, and it means that you can have a smaller aperture on your camera or a lower ISO setting. Now the other big advantage is that the majority of the time your fluorescent lights will come with replaceable bulbs. So that means that you can remove the bulbs that come with it, like I've done with this one, and then you can use a more expensive, higher quality bulb, which is going to give you a better color accuracy and often different wattages. So this is really nice because it means that you can just start with a fixture and build out from there depending on how much money you want to spend. And of course, if any of them break, you can easily replace them. They don't cost that much. So for the same price as this LED, you can buy a fluorescent light fixture with 4 bulbs, which are all much higher quality than this light, and will give you a much higher CRI without the red tint that you tend to get with these, and it'll also be far brighter. So now let's talk about the disadvantages of LEDs, and this links on from my last point in the fact that for this price of around £150, $250, you really can't find a LED that is going to have a good color accuracy. So this one is the R300, and it's the same story with my Aputure AL528, and pretty much anything up to the kind of $2,000 range, the LEDs are just not quite there in terms of technology in order to make really nice light. So essentially what this means is that it's not outputting the full spectrum of light, which means it's just never going to look as good as a high CRI light. And the other thing is that at this price, they're really not that bright. So the R300 is one of the brightest in its class in terms of price, but it's still nowhere near as bright as a fluorescent for the same price. So that means for the time being, LEDs are very expensive if you want them to have a high power output and a good color accuracy. And finally, let's talk about the disadvantages of fluorescent lights. So the first thing is that obviously you're not going to be able to use batteries with fluorescent lights. They only plug into mains power, which means that you are going to have to use extension leads and you're going to have cables coming from your lights. The second thing is that you have to be very careful when you're transporting the bulbs because they're very fragile, and then it takes a little while to set up because you have to screw in each bulb. So once you turn the light on, you'll find that the bulbs get pretty hot, so you just have to make sure that it's got some room for the air to get through to the bulbs, and then other than that it shouldn't really be a problem. it's not going to heat up the whole room like tungsten bulbs do, and you just have to wait a minute. They cool down pretty quickly once you've turned the light off. Then you can put them back in their cases before you go. So fluorescent light is usually pretty soft, and while this is an advantage, it's also a little bit of a disadvantage because you can't actually make a hard light source out of this light. So it's going to have a pretty wide beam, and it's not that easy to work with sometimes if you want to just have a spotlight. And finally, they don't have a dimmer like LEDs usually do. Now, most of the time you'll be able to turn off some of the bulbs individually, and this helps a lot in terms of controlling the power, but other than that you are going to have to either use diffusion to control the power, or move it further back, or use ND gels. So in conclusion, while I do think that it's really nice to be able to power your lights off batteries, when you're using LEDs, because they're just not bright enough, you have to have them so close in order to get a proper exposure after you've put diffusion on them, for example, that fluorescent lights are just a much better choice as a key light. So the nice thing about fluorescence is that you can use not even all of the bulbs, and you can bounce it off the ceiling, or you can put tons of diffusion through it, and it'll still be bright enough to use in most situations. But I do like to use LEDs as the rim light, because for the rim light I don't really mind about the CRI so much, and it's nice and convenient having that hard light source, which is a lot easier to flag off and stop from bouncing around the whole room and affecting the rest of your shot. So you can just put an LED in the background and it will only affect the person on the rim light without affecting the rest of the shot, so you can then let your fluorescence as the key and fill lights do the kind of main, soft, nice quality light. So for now I think there's a place for fluorescent and LED lights in your kit, but I think within a few years LEDs will have totally taken over, because the technology is getting better and better, and eventually we will be able to have that high quality light at a good power output. But until then, I'm definitely happy with my fluorescent lights. They're definitely bright enough, and I can usually find a place to plug them in, which isn't actually nearly as difficult as I thought it might be. That was why I originally went for LEDs, because I thought that the battery power was just going to be essential. But actually, in a way I prefer to work with plugs, because you don't have to remember to charge up your batteries. You don't have to swap them out every time the battery dies. But yes, that is my conclusion, that basically you should go for both and use your LEDs as rim lights and your fluorescent lights as key and fill. So yeah, that's it for this week, and I'll see you next time.